What makes a great piece? What makes a great composer? One of the best ways to explore these questions is by looking at works we admire. But the questions we need to ask in exploring them are somewhat different from those asked in most analysis courses. Here I want to explore some criteria for musical quality. These are things I see in music I admire, and they help me to improve my own work. Obviously, these criteria are mine. Other composers may or may not share them. But I can say that many times over the years, I've noticed these things in great music. Much of the difference between a theorist's approach to analysis and a composer's can be summed up in the word why. The aspiring composer needs not only to catalog the decisions made in a given piece, but must also try to understand the reasons behind them. For me, as for many people, music that impresses me must move me. It has clear, strong character, and its overall shape has a kind of narrative conviction. By narrative, I don't mean an explicit story, but rather that it gives me the feeling of a meaningful voyage over time. It catches my interest right away, develops in convincing ways, and then ends with some kind of satisfying resolution. Music I find unconvincing is usually just tepid, and its overall progression often seems more or less arbitrary. I discuss these things in depth in my book, Musical Composition, Craft, and Art. Here I want to underline how analyzing great music with these things in mind can make us better composers. I mentioned strong, vivid character. When I look at a piece I admire, I try to understand how the musical character is achieved. It always emerges from the interaction of various dimensions of the music: motives, phrase structure, timbre, tempo, and so on. To understand the music's perceived character, we must try to understand how and why the composer has combined these different elements. For example, a big build-up could be the result of more and more dissonant harmony, combined with orchestration covering a wider and wider registral range and a crescendo. Once we understand the components of a given musical situation like this, we can apply the knowledge elsewhere. The details may be different, but the general principles are the same. What we're trying to do here is to understand all the dimensions of the composer's craft in a deeper way. In fact, this is the real meaning of craft, not learning a bunch of rigid rules about what not to do, or a collection of traditional recipes, but rather understanding the tools available to achieve a given musical result. Again, the key question is always, why did the composer make these choices? We may not always find the exact right answer, but if we don't even try, we're wasting a wonderful opportunity. An example. We hear a line full of suspensions, say in Bach. We could label the suspension 7/6, 4/3, and so on, but that in itself doesn't tell us very much of interest. More interesting would be to notice how strong are the respective dissonances. If we imagine a scale of dissonance, semitones are more intense than whole tones, and dissonances sound weaker the farther apart they are in register and timbre. Where in the phrase do the sharpest dissonances occur? Why are the dissonances placed where they are? Suspensions were originally just an easy way for a chorus to sing a dissonance on the beat. By the time Bach was writing, often for instruments, composers came to understand that suspensions can be used to create rhythmic and harmonic richness as well. They're also an excellent way to avoid rhythmic squareness at key points and to keep up the music momentum. This is why Bach so often makes fugal entries coincide with suspensions in other voices. Another example. Say we observe a passage in Beethoven where several successive phrases get shorter and shorter. Again, why? Well, progressively shortening phrases is a way to increase intensity. It's as though we're breathing faster and faster. Or let's say we observe a theme with two symmetrical phrases. Symmetrical phrasing tends to make music easier to remember. Perhaps this is the first presentation of an important theme, or perhaps the mood is rather light. Symmetry, being relatively predictable, creates less emotional intensity, all other things being equal. An example from harmony, a phrase with a deceptive cadence. Why? Obviously, to allow the music to make a detour instead of arriving at a simpler, more predictable goal. If that's the case, the detour should be something wonderful. A basic rule of musical form: don't attract the listener's attention only to disappoint them. In music by a first-rate composer, all these technical details are informed decisions, not just random events. And ultimately, their role is to enrich the musical experience for the listener. My central point here about craft is that a good composer needs to deeply understand the effect of every aspect of the music. A solid training should lead to this kind of understanding. That's why, in my online counterpoint course, I propose as a motto, no rules without reasons. Often, poor music is the result of distraction. For example, a composer may be trying to build up to a climax, but several instruments drop out along the way. The result is that crescendo is tepid rather than forceful, less musically effective. A poor composer uses techniques in an unthinking way. A good composer uses them to maximum effect, appropriately in the musical context. Music is a temporal art, so when things happen is critical. When I mentioned narrative structure above, I meant that a beginning should not sound like an ending. Transitions should not always be the same. Sometimes the ideas should flow very smoothly, whereas at other times they will need more surprising turns. There should also be some sense of intensification over the whole piece. Not necessarily a dynamic crescendo, but a feeling that the listener is gradually more and more drawn intensely into the music. The music takes us on an increasingly absorbing emotional voyage. One last thing we can analyze in great composer music. A real composer has a voice, a recognizable personal sound. For example, Brahms often uses 3/2, or hemiola rhythms, expressing a kind of inner tension or longing. Stravinsky has a very characteristic cross-cutting technique. These are only two very obvious features of these composers' styles. They combine with other preferences, harmony, orchestration, phrasing, and so on, to give each composer a recognizable face. This is usually not something done deliberately, but rather is just the result of various musical preferences, refined over time, working together. This idea of a personal voice needs to be distinguished from the more superficial notion of originality. It's not hard to be original. For example, I could propose a piece called Ocean Waves, in which all the string instruments are filled with water. However, string instruments filled with water have no particularly interesting sound, not to mention that the water can actually harm them. Real originality is much rarer. It emerges from an expressive need. The great originals in music history, like Beethoven, Wagner, and Debussy, didn't do unusual things just to be different, but because they had powerful emotional ideas that couldn't be expressed with the existing resources at the time. As I said at the start, these are some of my own criteria. Other composers will have others. But my criteria are not arbitrary. They are observable in great music in the repertoire, and they can be verified by careful, thoughtful analysis. Aspiring composers need to gradually discover their own criteria in order to progress. So when you hear something you find really powerful in a successful existing piece, try to understand exactly what contributes to its effect. This kind of analysis, analyzing for quality, can be very enriching.